So, Washington just applied agricultural trade pressure to the one country whose rail infrastructure moves American grain to Pacific markets. Not a trade war Canada couldn't survive. Not a pressure campaign Ottawa had no answer for. Something quieter, something more structural. Washington turned up the heat without checking what was running underneath the floor. And Mark Carney didn't need to hold a press conference. The map already said everything that needed to be said. This is the kind of miscalculation that doesn't announce itself with a headline. It builds quietly. It accumulates in logistics reports, in shipping schedules, in the gap between when grain leaves a Kansas farm and when it reaches a buyer in Tokyo. Washington read this scenario as leverage. A tariff here, a public declaration there. Political signaling calibrated to a domestic audience, designed to look strong before an election cycle, designed to remind Canada who the senior partner is in this relationship. But leverage is not the same as control, and pressure applied to the wrong point doesn't bend the target, it bends the system. When the system bends, it doesn't only affect Ottawa. It affects the supply chain that feeds American farmers, American grocers, and American households who have nothing to do with the trade dispute at all. This is what happens when political pressure is measured in speeches and strategic patience is measured in rail corridors and harvest calendars. Trump sees the tariff, Carney sees the infrastructure underneath it, and the infrastructure is not neutral. When you understand the hidden geography of American grain exports, the structural dependency on Canadian rail corridors, and Washington's fundamental mistake in reading leverage as a function of economic size rather than operational control, you begin to see why this is not just a trade dispute. This is a test of who actually read the map. The United States produces enormous volumes of grain. The Midwest is one of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet, but production is not export. To reach Pacific markets, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that grain needs to travel west. And the most efficient routes west, the ones that run on time, that have the capacity to handle seasonal harvest volumes, that operate on the schedules that Asian buyers depend on, run through Canada. Ottawa did not build this map to win an argument. Geography built it first. Ottawa simply studied it. Let me take you through how the pressure turned around. Washington's trade pressure campaign against Canada began the way most political pressure campaigns begin, with an assumption. The assumption was simple, almost elegant in its confidence. The American economy is larger. The American market is larger. Therefore, American leverage is larger. If Washington applies pressure through tariffs, through declarations, through the careful orchestration of political signals designed to look like strength, Canada will eventually come to the table on American terms. This is how political leverage is supposed to work, and in many contexts, it does work. Larger economies have structural advantages in trade negotiations. The ability to deny market access is a real form of power. Washington has exercised this power before. The logic is not irrational. The logic is just incomplete. Because the calculation Washington made, leverage equals economic scale, stops being accurate the moment you examine how the trade actually moves. Not where goods are produced, not where they are consumed, how they travel between the two. Here is what the map shows. The map Washington apparently did not study before launching the pressure campaign. American grain from the Great Plains, from Kansas, from North Dakota, from Montana, from the agricultural interior of the country moves toward Pacific ports through Canadian rail corridors in significant volume. This is not a minor tributary of the supply chain. This is a primary route. The infrastructure that handles these shipments, the rail lines, the switching yards, the inspection facilities, the port-side logistics, a substantial portion of this infrastructure runs on Canadian soil, operates under Canadian management, and moves on Canadian timetables. The buyers on the other end, grain importers in Japan, purchasing agents in South Korea, buyers in Taiwan contract on seasonal schedules. Harvest season creates a delivery window. That window is not infinitely flexible. A delayed shipment is not simply a rescheduled shipment. A delayed shipment is a missed contract, a renegotiated price, a relationship that begins looking for alternatives with a quiet but permanent urgency. Mark Carney understood this map not because he is smarter than Washington's trade team, but because he reads different documents. Washington's team reads tariff schedules, trade balances, GDP comparisons. Carney reads operational maps. He reads logistics reports. He reads the gap between a harvest deadline and a shipping window, and he understands intuitively what that gap means when a diplomatic relationship is under political strain. Ottawa did not publicize this understanding. That is precisely the point. Canada did not hold a press conference to announce its leverage. It did not threaten to close the corridor. It did not issue a counter-declaration or match Washington noise for noise. It simply continued operating the system it had always operated and waited for the pressure to arrive at the pressure point Canada had already quietly marked on the map. The pressure did not take long. Grain farmers in the American Midwest began to feel the friction before anyone used the word leverage. Logistics friction, delays in scheduling, the subtle accumulation of operational uncertainty that develops when a trade relationship is under political stress, began adding cost. Not visible cost, not headline cost, the quiet kind, the kind that shows up in the gap between what a farmer expected to receive and what a buyer was willing to pay once delivery timelines became uncertain. This is how real leverage works, not in press releases, in timetables. Picture the room this way, not because anyone confirmed what happened inside it, but because the logic of the situation creates the room whether or not the cameras are present. In Washington, the pressure campaign is running. The tariff signals have been sent. The political machinery is in motion, generating the kind of noise that plays well on cable news, that lands in the states where agricultural voters pay close attention to executive trade posture. The message from Washington is clear. We have the leverage. We are applying it. Canada will come to the table on our terms. The room in Washington has a particular quality in this moment. It is confident. The people in it have measured the situation by the metrics they always use: market size, trade volume, economic output, and the metrics all point the same direction. The United States is larger. The United States is stronger. The United States sets the terms. There is no one in the room asking about rail corridors. Now picture a different room. The important thing is not the furniture. It is the asymmetry. In Ottawa, the atmosphere is different, not tense, not reactive. The cadence of the conversation is slower, more methodical. There is a map, not a metaphorical map, but an actual logistical representation of how grain moves from American farmland to Pacific ports. The map shows something that does not appear in the tariff schedules Washington is using to calibrate its pressure. It shows the choke points, the places where the flow of grain, moving under contractual obligation toward seasonal buyers with non-negotiable delivery windows, passes through infrastructure that Canada operates. The scene almost writes itself. On one side, a political operation applying pressure designed for a domestic audience. On the other, a man who spent years reading the operational architecture of financial systems, a former central bank governor who understands instinctively that real vulnerability does not live in the publicly declared leverages. It lives in the hidden dependencies, the ones that have been functioning quietly for so long that no one thought to put them on a risk map. Carney does not need to threaten. He does not need to match Washington's volume. He needs only to let the system answer. And the system will answer on schedule, not on anyone's political schedule, on the harvest calendar, on the shipping timetable, on the contractual deadline that the buyer in Tokyo set months ago and has no interest in renegotiating because a trade dispute on the other side of the Pacific developed at an inconvenient time. Washington has a press conference. Canada has the pressure point. The silence that follows Washington's opening move is not Ottawa's weakness, it is Ottawa's posture. It is the silence of a side that does not need to announce its leverage because the leverage is structural, built into the geography, built into the contracts, built into the shipping schedules that will not pause for a tariff dispute to resolve before the harvest deadline arrives. Think carefully about what that silence means. Washington interprets it as hesitation, as Canada absorbing the blow, as a smaller economy calculating how long it can hold out before it returns to the table on American terms. Washington's read of the silence is itself the mistake. The silence is not hesitation. It is patience. The patience of a side that knows the clock is running and that the clock is not running against Ottawa. The moment the pressure campaign begins to encounter the operational reality of the corridor, the room in Washington changes temperature, not dramatically. Not with a single piece of intelligence that shifts everything at once. It changes slowly. The way a room changes when someone realizes, without anyone saying it aloud, that the assumption the entire strategy was built on may have been incomplete. No one in Washington needs to be told the leverage has moved. The system begins to show it. Shipping schedules begin accumulating friction. Farmers in North Dakota, in Kansas, in Montana, begin receiving information about delivery windows that differs from what they expected. Not because anyone made a formal decision to disrupt the corridor, but because trade relationships under political stress develop friction naturally, and that friction adds cost, and that cost does not stay in the logistics report. It migrates toward the farm gate. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows on both sides. In Washington, it is the silence of people recalculating. In Ottawa, it is the silence of people who already knew what the recalculation would find. The room in Ottawa does not change. Carney does not look triumphant. He does not look relieved. He looks like someone who read the map before the meeting started and is now watching the meeting arrive at the map. The important thing is not the politics, it is the geography, and the geography does not negotiate. The moment arrives without ceremony. That is what makes it significant. There is no summit, no dramatic exchange, no single call that changes everything, no press conference where the reversal becomes official. That is not how structural leverage expresses itself. Structural leverage does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives on a timetable. Picture Carney this way. He is looking at the logistics report, the document that shows where the grain is moving, where it is slowing, where the pressure points are beginning to express themselves as costs rather than as diplomatic signals. He does not need to read it closely. He already knows what it says. He has known for some time. He places the document on the table, not with force, not with the theatrical weight of someone making a point, with the quiet certainty of someone who doesn't need to make the point aloud because the map is making it. The room understands, not through words, through the alignment between what the map shows and what the pressure campaign has now encountered. There is a silence, and into that silence, 8 words. The map was always there. They never looked. 8 words. That was all. Not a threat. Not a declaration. A diagnosis. The kind of sentence that requires no follow-up because it contains the entire story within itself. The map existed before the pressure began. The dependency was visible before anyone chose to treat it as a weapon. Washington simply had not looked. The most consequential moves in geopolitics rarely announce themselves. They are recognized quietly after the fact. A logistics strategist, the kind of mind that reads not the headline but the route, not the press conference but the shipping schedule, would recognize this pattern immediately. Every system of real leverage shares the same structure. It is not the thing that is loudest. It is the thing that cannot be substituted. A tariff creates friction. A choke point creates inescapability. Washington confused the two. Washington applied a tariff and expected to create leverage. But the dependency was not on the American side of the equation. The dependency was on the corridor, and the corridor ran through Canada. The principle is older than trade policy, older than geopolitics as a formal discipline. Real leverage does not live where the noise is. Real leverage lives at the point the system cannot bypass. In this scenario, that point was not a negotiating table in any capital. It was not a government building or a summit hall. It was a rail corridor running through the geographic interior of a continent, carrying agricultural products toward a shipping window that buyers in Asia had set months in advance and had no reason to extend. Washington had scale. Canada had the choke point. And scale, when it encounters a choke point, does not automatically win. Scale needs to move. And when movement requires passing through a point you do not control, the scale becomes secondary. The choke point becomes primary. The side that controls the choke point controls the timeline. The side that controls the timeline controls the cost. The side that controls the cost controls the negotiation, even if they never say a single word about it out loud. The quiet side often wins because it prepared before the loud side noticed. Trump had pressure. Carney had the map. Watch the cascade. Allies observing this scenario from outside trade partners in Europe, in Asia, in other economies, running their own calculations about how to position relative to Washington's trade posture, do not need an official briefing to understand what the situation reveals. The signal is strategic. It says that Washington's pressure campaigns, calibrated for political performance, can expose American farmers to operational risk before they expose Canadian policy to diplomatic pressure. For governments watching the contrast between Washington's volume and Ottawa's operational preparation, this is the kind of data point that quietly shifts probability estimates without a press release, without a formal announcement, the way strategic reassessment always happens at the level that actually matters. Inside the supply chain itself, the reaction is not ideological, it is operational. Grain buyers in Pacific markets begin pricing delivery risk into their procurement decisions. Logistics operators managing the corridor begin receiving questions they have not been asked before. Agricultural commodity traders watching friction accumulate in shipping schedules begin adjusting the cost models they use to advise their clients. None of this constitutes a crisis, but all of it is a cost, a risk premium added here, a longer procurement lead time built in there, a quiet diversification in sourcing that no one announces but everyone begins preparing for. By the time these costs arrive at grocery shelves, no one can trace them to a single tariff decision, but they are there, and they are moving in one direction. The domestic political fracture for Washington is the sharpest edge. The constituencies most exposed to the logistics friction generated by this pressure campaign are not Canadian, they are American. Midwestern farmers who need the corridor to move their grain on schedule. Food retailers absorbing the cost of supply chain uncertainty. Voters in agricultural states who pay grocery bills and do not follow trade policy closely enough to understand why prices are rising, only that they are. The pressure campaign was designed to play well with a domestic base, but when the costs of the campaign begin arriving inside that same base, the political geometry becomes deeply uncomfortable. The choice is stark. Maintain the pressure and explain the costs, or acknowledge the miscalculation and lose the narrative. Neither option arrives cleanly. And from the perspective of strategic adversaries observing the exchange, the lesson is not subtle. American power at the level of political declaration and economic scale remains formidable. But American operational dependencies, the logistics infrastructure, the supply corridors, the physical geography of how American goods actually travel from production to market are less well understood by Washington itself than they should be. That gap between declared power and operational vulnerability is precisely the kind of asymmetry that sophisticated adversaries study carefully and remember indefinitely. Washington had the largest economy in the negotiation. Carney had the most accurate map. The map won. This is the lesson that does not appear in trade textbooks, but lives in every negotiation ever decided by geography rather than ambition. Size is not control. Volume is not leverage. Pressure applied to the wrong point is not strength. It is exposure. It exposes what you did not check. It exposes the dependencies you assumed were neutral. It exposes the belief that because you are larger, the smaller side has no recourse. The smaller side always has recourse. The recourse is the choke point you forgot to map. Carney did not win this scenario with a counter tariff. He did not win it with a speech, a threat, or a diplomatic ultimatum. He won it by having read the document Washington had not read. By understanding that in a seasonal supply chain with contractual deadlines, time is leverage and time runs on a physical timetable, not a political one. The preparation was the weapon. The patience was the strategy. The silence was the signal. In every high-stakes negotiation, there are two kinds of leverage: the leverage you declare and the leverage that declares itself. Washington declared its leverage. Canada allowed its leverage to declare itself through shipping schedules, through corridor capacity, through the accumulating cost of friction in a supply chain that had to move whether the politics were resolved or not. Pressure is only power until the other side controls the clock. Carney controlled the clock. Washington brought a microphone. So here is where we stand. Washington launched an agricultural trade pressure campaign against Canada. Tariffs, declarations, political signals calibrated for domestic effect. The operating assumption: economic scale translates into operational control. Carney understood the system underneath that assumption. He read the logistics map. He knew where American grain moves to reach Pacific markets. He knew which corridors it passes through, the harvest windows it runs against, the contractual deadlines that buyers in Asia had set and were not going to renegotiate for the convenience of a trade dispute happening on the other side of the continent. Ottawa said nothing. Ottawa did not need to say anything. The pressure campaign met the corridor. The corridor did not yield. The friction accumulated not as a policy decision, but as an operational reality. Farmers in the Midwest began absorbing costs they did not expect. Grocery prices began moving in directions that no official announcement explained. The political architecture of the pressure campaign began encountering the physical architecture of how supply chains actually work. And the dependency Washington had never placed on its map became the most consequential fact in the room. The map was always there. They never looked. 8 words. The entirety of the strategic error compressed into a sentence. The map was not a secret. The dependency was not hidden. The corridor had always been there, doing exactly what it had always done, waiting for someone to finally ask what would happen when the relationship that maintained it came under political stress. Washington had the pressure. Canada had the geography. Geography does not negotiate. Now the questions that matter going forward. If this dependency exists in agricultural logistics, where else in American supply chains are there structural choke points that have never appeared on Washington's trade strategy map? What happens to the political coalition that supported the pressure campaign when the costs begin arriving inside that coalition's own households? And what does it mean for the future of American trade leverage that the most significant miscalculation in this scenario came not from a hostile adversary, but from the assumption that a neighboring ally had no map of its own? Think about that. Leave your answer in the comments below. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.